Welcome and good evening to all of you who have been signing up for our webinar tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our RECONNECT webinar that we are doing together with the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies and the World Justice Project tonight on a particular topic, the rule of law in Europe, insights from the 2021 Rule of Law Index. As you all know, these are difficult times for the rule of law in the world and in Europe. And the particular Rule of Law Index is presented to us tonight by Dr. Alejandro Ponce, the Chief Research Officer from the World Justice Project. Good evening, good morning, Alejandro Ponce, to you. We also have two discussants who will come in from their respective perspectives on the rule of law and on the findings of the Rule of Law Index. Professor Petra Bard, a RECONNECT researcher from the Central European University, and also Professor Adam Bodnar, the Dean of the Law Faculty of the Warsaw SWPS University and former Ombudsman of Poland. I would like to introduce to you the topic very briefly by saying that actually the World Justice Rule of Law Index 2021 is, as you may know, the latest report in an annual series which provides original and independent data on the rule of law performance around the globe. And tonight, we want to focus on the latest insights of the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index. We will do so, as I said before, through the first presentation by Dr. Ponce, and then afterwards, we will focus specifically on the insights from Europe with a particular view on Hungary and Poland. But of course, in the discussion, we can also make the link to other countries, other developments, both within Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, as well as other countries around the world. So to all of you, you are more than welcome to intervene, to ask your questions in the chat. There will be a lot of opportunity to do so after our presentations. And with that, I would like to give now the floor to Dr. Ponce.
Thank you very much, Kolja. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to present some of the findings of the report that was released a few weeks ago and summarize some of the findings from the latest data collection of the Rule of Law Index. A little bit just for those who are new to the project. So the World Justice Project is an independent organization with a headquarters in Washington, D.C. And for many years, we have been producing this measurement to try to capture the status of the rule of law around the world from the perspective of the people living in the different countries. All right. A little bit of the background of what we are measuring as part of the index. So the index is composed of 8 indicators or factors or pillars that essentially summarize these 2 basic ideas of the rule of law, that the law imposes constraints on the power of the government, but at the same time also imposes constraints on what citizens can do, and the state is responsible for enforcing those laws. So the first elements that we observe: constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, and fundamental rights, captures this first idea on the government bound by law and the constraints that the law imposes in practice to exercise of power. And then on the second one is just these constraints that citizens must abide to the laws, right? And that's what we have in factor 5 of order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. So the intention of the index is really to provide a holistic view of the situation that countries are facing, just when talking about rule of law, to really just have this multidimensional perspective on some of the different issues, but at the same time provide information that can help us identify some of the issues arising in countries in each one of these different areas. Each one of these indicators is further disaggregated. So overall, we have 44 indicators. So this is all the information is available on the website. For example, when we talk about constraints on government powers, we talk about essentially the governmental and non-governmental checks, such as judicial independence or government powers effectively limited by the legislator or by independent auditing and review institutions, non-governmental checks, and so on. So essentially, the intention here is to disaggregate further the concepts that I mentioned in the previous slide. A little bit of this rule of law index, this edition of the index 2021 includes 139 countries and jurisdictions and surveys to over more than 100,000 people, 138,000 people, and more than 4,000 experts. So essentially, in order to collect information in each one of the countries, we do a general population poll to 1,000 people in each one of the countries, asking questions about either perception or experience questions that can map into the different indicators that I presented before and that the public can answer. And then we supplement that with interviews to practitioners in the different countries, lawyers in different areas of the law, either civil, criminal, labor, and ask them questions about the functioning of the state institutions. We combined all this information. We have about more than 500 questions coming either from the public or the experts. We map them into the different indicators, and that's how we create the scores. The scores are between 0 and 1, where 1 is more adherence to the rule of law. And the questions are asked in a way that allows us to compare countries against each other. So taking into account the different institutions across countries. This year, for the first time, we're covering the entire EU. So we added 11 countries and we're able to cover the entire EU. Then the period of the data collection this year was a little bit delayed because of the pandemic. So the period of data collection was from October 2020 to May 2021. And as I mentioned before, it includes the 8 factors and the 44 sub-factors. All the information is presented in the form of country profiles that are either are available in PDFs on the website, but also just you can look at all the information in the website, as well as how the different indicators have evolved over time in the different countries. So let me just go quickly about some of the findings, first the global findings, and then go into some of the findings in Europe. So first, we present information in the forms of tables and rankings, just for each one of the different countries summarized, and I'm not going to go into the details, but just some of the very big findings that we see. Number one is that these are some of the countries that decline the most in rule of law. And what you see here is that most of the countries, about more than 70% of the countries declined in rule of law scores over the previous year. So this is consistent just across all the different regions of the world, or across all the different income levels. And here are some of the countries that decline and improve the most. And this is, in this graph, we can see it more clearly. What you have in the x-axis is the score of the index in 2021. So it's between 0 and 1. So when 1 is more adherence to the rule of law. And then on the y-axis, you can see the percentage change in the score. So two things. So one is, as I was mentioning, most of the dots are in red. So most of the dots actually show a decline in the rule of law scores in the aggregate score of the countries. And also all this decline happened throughout the spectrum of rule of law. So even though it's more pronounced, probably just in the middle sector, but still we see some countries with high rule of law scores that also showed a decline during the previous year. This decline, so this information is again available, so what we see overall is that countries change from one year to the next. It's very weird to see constant declines or constant improvements. In many cases, a pattern that we see around the world is that this changes in many cases with administrations, in which we see big jumps, particularly in the first year of the administration or the first and the second year. Then the changes are less pronounced. But what we see is just a lot of ups and downs just in changes over time. So this is just starting in 2015, the last 5 years, looking at a series of countries, and we can see clearly just that the last year we saw a more pronounced decline. Some of the findings from last year. So number one, as I was mentioning before, most of the countries, about 70% of the countries, more than 70% of the countries show a decline in rule of law scores. Well, we also saw that in more than 70% of the countries, we saw important declines in this first factor or indicator on constraints on government powers, which essentially summarizes checks and balances. So that's, again, something that we saw in all the regions of the world. In some countries, this was very, very pronounced, but this was consistent across the globe, in which most countries actually show this. So that's the first finding. Just second finding, what we see is that in most countries of the world, also the civic space closed. What we have in this graph, these are histograms of 3 dimensions of civic space, and essentially the percentage of countries that are either showing positive or negative changes. In red is negative changes, in blue is positive changes. And these are the three dimensions that we measure in the index that compose civic space: civic participation, where we see a large number of the countries decline, freedom of opinion and expression, and freedom of assembly. When we combine the 3 of them, the map shows that 82% of the countries experience a decline in at least one of the dimensions of the civic space during the previous year. Finally, the last finding, the next finding, is that we also saw declines in the administration of justice, both in criminal, civil, and administrative proceedings. So this is a similar graph with a histogram, red and blue. And what we see is both in the delays in administrative proceedings, delays in civil justice, or delays in criminal adjudication in the past year, we see that most countries actually experience declines in the indicators measuring this. And overall, when we combine the 3 figures, 94% of the countries experience a decline in at least one of these areas. Finally, something that we see this year as well is that in 67% of the countries, the indicators that measure equal treatment and absence of discrimination declined. In some cases, the changes were quite significant. And this was, for the most part, just something that we saw in all regions of the world. The EU was the region in which this decline was less pronounced as compared to others, but still we saw some declines in this. So a little bit of summarizing the information, whether this is the pandemic or it's a compounding effect. So the weakening of institutions that we see last year occurred in a context of growing authoritarianism. So this is the 4th year in which more countries suffer declines than improvements in the rule of law. And the pandemic actually deepened this trend and spread this trend. So what that means is that more countries experienced decline this year as compared to the previous year, but also the countries that were decline even more this year. Number 2 is that justice delays occurred in a context of limited lack of innovation, unlimited access and lack of innovation. We didn't see a negative trend in the previous years, but what we saw was that many countries, justice systems actually lacked access. Many people lacked access. In a previous study that the World Justice Project conducted, we found that about more than 5 billion people lacked access to justice, combining all sources of information available, and also lack of innovation. We know that the justice sector is a sector that in many countries has lacked innovation. And finally, discrimination. And discrimination, just we don't have a clear response on why this is happening. This could be in part because of unequal responses and effects of the pandemic, that we have seen the pandemic affected certain groups more prominently, in part of structural factors. We saw also in some parts of the world that there was more awareness about discrimination, due to events that happened last year as well. But also something that is interesting of this finding is that the discrimination, the decline in the discrimination scores were more pronounced in countries that were already declining or that were experiencing growing authoritarianism, which is consistent with this trend that we have seen of going against particular groups and so on, or this narrative of us versus others and so on, which may actually fuel discrimination under stressful circumstances. Finally, just talking a little bit about the rule of law in Europe. Europe continues to be the region with the strongest rule of law in the world. We see this is the rankings of the different countries in Europe. Just the way that we classify the countries, we add as well the United States and Canada, but for most of the countries are really just in Europe, just with the Nordic countries at the top, and then we see some of the countries like Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Poland at the bottom. Some of the changes from the previous year. So many countries experience declines, so more countries experience declines and improvements. We see Poland experienced the largest decline in Europe last year, but even some of the countries experience also declines, and the countries that improved, indeed, the improvements were very, very small, were marginal, just in most of the countries that show an improvement. Looking more closely at Poland and Hungary, so the Poland experienced a decline last year of -2.4% and Hungary -1.4%. However, when we look at the trends over the last years, when we look at how much the scores have declined over the previous year, we see considerable deterioration in the quality of the rule of law in these two countries. So this is the summary of the different factors, particularly constraints on moral powers, fundamental rights, in which, for example, the two countries have experienced declines of more than 20%, or even just in civil justice or criminal justice have experienced considerable declines over the previous years. This is not something that happens one year, but that we have been seeing constantly over the previous years. And so the result today, for example, in the case of Hungary, is that the country ranking in constraints of moral power is 117 out of 139 countries. Just some other components as well have deteriorated. And when we look at the individual indicators, so this is the country profile, we see in the case of constraints on moral powers, for example, just the checks and balances, legislative, judiciary, auditing, just well below what we see in other areas in Europe, or even when we look at just civil justice and criminal justice, the areas of knowing proper government influence, which talks about the independence of the judiciary, just we see scores well below, as well as the scores on discrimination. Poland, kind of a similar picture, just probably not as pronounced as the scores that we have in Hungary, even though last year we had a remarkable decline in both fundamental rights and control. But the picture just on judicial independence, constraints on government influence, as well as on the checks and balances, is well below what we see in Europe. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I see that there are first questions in the chat. And one of them is basically a question on your methodology. So allow me to briefly bring that question in before we go to our two discussants. It's actually Dieter Böckem who is asking whether you have compared your results with other indicators, for example, the worldwide governance indicators, and are your results consistent with these other indicators? Perhaps you can briefly answer that.
I will talk briefly about it. The governance indicators indeed is a composite index that uses a lot of sources. Indeed, they use our source. They use the index as one of the sources for compiling the data. So as part of the validation exercise that we conduct, we'll review each one of the data points, and then we'll review as well the scores against all the different indicators available that could map different indicators. So we select the indicators that match more closely each one of the indicators that we have, and check just the indicators for consistency, both in terms of where the country is placed and how the country is moving. It's just simply as a check. I mean, it doesn't necessarily change our findings. It's simply just to check to understand better the data. In some cases, allow us to look at some problems with the data, outliers, problems in coding and so on, but it's something that we do, as well as qualitative sources. We also compare the results against reports on human rights, news reports, and so on that we collect over the course of the year, and we compare it against those sources.
Thank you very much. And I would like to now give Petra the floor, Petra Bard, who is joining us and who will have who will share with us her insights and her comments, especially from the European perspective, but also more specifically the Hungarian perspective.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I shall say a few words about the state of the art in Hungary as well, and especially what is behind the numbers that are so well reflecting the situation on the ground. So indeed, during the past couple of years, the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index documented a very worrying trend, with Poland and Hungary declining the most of any country in the EU after North America region. And indeed, it was already in 2020 when Hungary reached its laws. It had the region's lowest scores for constraints on governmental powers, open government, fundamental rights, regulatory enforcement, civil justice. So the rule of law in general, perhaps with the exception of certain aspects of criminal justice and security. So the reason Hungary did not go any lower in 2021 is that there is no lower. It is on place 31 out of 31 jurisdictions in its cluster. So this also corresponds to assessments and indices by other think tanks. For example, Varieties of Democracy holds that Hungary is no democracy any longer, by Freedom House stopped putting Hungary among the free countries. Even though Article 2 values that are enshrined in the Treaty on the European Union, which is the quasi-constitutional foundation of the EU. So even though these values, including the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights, had been taken for granted for quite some time, we reached a point which is very reflected by the numbers when the EU is now harboring member states that are no constitutional democracies anymore. Hungary and Poland could not join the EU were they to apply today. Little wonder that these are the two countries which are currently subjected to Article 7.1 procedures designed to determine a clear risk of a serious breach of the mentioned values. Now, the first step in the deconstruction of the rule of law probably was the adoption of the new constitution a decade ago in a dubious procedure against the ignorance of the majority of the people, so there was no constitutional movement whatsoever, and a strong opposition of those who cared, including civil society, academics, and opposition politicians. Also, a number of system-relevant issues were carved in stone by laws that now, under the new constitutional setting, require supermajority. The curtailment of the powers of the Constitutional Court was the next step, which happened as a direct response to the Constitutional Court, holding some of the governmental steps unconstitutional. With the adoption of the Fourth Amendment to the Fundamental Law in 2013, the government, I think, crossed the red line and made clear that it would use all its legal tools available, even in violation of the rule of law, to get away with all constraints on governmental powers, when it inserted provisions into the Constitution which had been declared to be unconstitutional beforehand. So now the Constitutional Court did not have the power anymore to rule again on the provisions it had previously declared unconstitutional because everything was constitutionally entrenched. Simultaneously with cutting back the powers of the Constitutional Court, it was also filled with people loyal to the government, overriding the previous custom that the opposition had also to agree on nominations. The now captured Constitutional Court is an important government ally, not confronting the government in system-relevant questions. Whether it is life imprisonment or free speech of government critiques, messing with academic freedom or shrinking space for civil society, the European Court of Human Rights and the Court of Justice of the EU often do the job or take over the job that the Constitutional Court should do by way of constitutional review. But they have, of course, only limited jurisdiction, and also European institutions were rather passive with making use of all the tools they have available to enforce the rule of law. So EU responses especially came too late or were too little. So the government got away with not only with compromising the Constitutional Court, but also removing the most experienced judges from top courts, squashing the ombudsman system as we knew it, jeopardizing media pluralism, curtailing academic freedom, stigmatizing NGOs, human rights defenders, and scapegoating vulnerable minorities. So even the thinnest understanding of the rule of law fails to be met, since elections are not considered to be fair anymore by international observers. Being a rule of law violator, of course, is a great stigma, so value infringements often have a veneer of legality. Relying on the theory of cheating, developed most recently by András Sajó, so doing away with checks and balances seem to be embedded into legal rules. But instead of admitting what is actually happening, namely changing laws and institutions with the sole aim of retaining power and money, the illiberal government makes efforts to mix legality with the rule of law and argue that everything they do is legal. Showing these veiled attempts to destroy the rule of law, systems such as the Hungarian regime are characterized by terms such as hybrid regime or constitutional populism or abusive constitutionalism. Now, what are the techniques used for making these claims or for pretending that Hungary is still a state based on the rule of law? So first, false or distorted pieces of information are being created, including mistranslation or misrepresentation of facts. Then there are misleading reading of statistics or scholarship. Often there is misuse of comparative law in a way that seeks to demonstrate that Hungary fares not worse, but better than some of the member states that are criticizing Hungary. This leads to whataboutery or a claim of double standards. Then the rule of law is presented as impossible to define with adequate precision, so it can be abused for political goals. Then there is a delaying tactic, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and more dialogue to gain time and delay sanctions meant to uphold the rule of law. Also, there are red herrings. Often they are they take the form of human rights violations, very outrageous ones, that divert attention from more prominent issues that the government is trying to hide. One of the very obvious examples, and here the EU reacted forcefully, is the Anti-Lgbti Law, framed or packaged as a child protection piece of legislation that is there to divert attention from the invitation of the Chinese University Fudan into the capital of Hungary, or corruption, or the Pegasus software scandal and the wiretapping scandal. And finally, and this is what I would like to emphasize last, is once they cannot counter the criticism, they counter the critique. So as part of a broader legitimizing strategy, the rule of law is presented as being anti-democratic for seeking to override democratic decisions based on diktats from non-democratic players. So this is the majority will argument. These are arguments seeking to maintain pluralism and diverse landscape of states, maintaining their national identities, as well as arguments blaming that Brussels is akin to Moscow and Soviet dictatorship and enters into an imperialist oppression. Not just rule of law enforcement, but any type of monitoring is dismissed along this logic. For example, in the EU, both rule of law monitoring and also rule of law enforcement mechanisms are dismissed, claiming that the only procedure foreseen is Article 7, and every action beyond that would be ultra vires. But this type of the last one does go beyond the EU, questioning virtually all human rights and rule of law reports. The methodology of the World Justice Project was, for example, questioned, and it was linked to George Soros through organizations and experts handpicked to support political attacks on Hungary. Now, paradoxically, this claim was made by the leader of a gongo established by the government to push government propaganda. More than anything, this shows that only a methodologically correct assessment where method and procedure are transparent, objectivity and academic excellence are guaranteed, and where scrutiny is based on equal treatment of the states covered can counter such criticism and solidify legitimacy. Endeavors such as the World Justice Project, in this sense, can provide a good practice for the EU. EU institutions can, of course, rely on the one hand on the reports and the numbers, but also from a methodological perspective, it can inspire an EU-specific scrutiny for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra, for your comments, which confirm the findings of the law index, but also qualify the findings in the sense that you explained, I think, in great detail why, and I quote you, it could not get lower. Let us also discuss some remarks in the chat. I invite everybody again to ask your questions, to also come in with comments, or have alternative readings or questions. While you are doing that, I would like to pass on the floor to Adam Bodnar, who will continue from his perspective with the assessment of the findings of the rule index.
Thank you very much for inviting this important panel discussion about the recent report by the World Justice Project. Thank you to RECONNECT and Justice University of Leuven and basically all the friends of the rule of law throughout the world. It is always difficult to speak after Petra because Petra is always concise and precise that it is difficult to catch basically the same tone, but I will do. So the first thing, the most important, is that World Justice Project report, rule of law report, should not be read in isolation concerning just one single year. I think it is important to look at the trend, and both in case of Poland and Hungary, this trend is just going with every year lower and lower. So if you compare the situation between now and, let's say, in Poland 2015 with respect to Hungary 2011, you see how dramatic change happened. How differently the state operates, which is basically qualified in numbers on the basis of this report. So, you know, when I've read this report this year, in fact, to be honest, I was surprised that we are still so high, that we are still so high in the ranking. Maybe because, you know, the report is published later than just at the end of 2020. And then, you know, over the first 9 months of so many things have happened already that contributed further to that you simply have this impression that it is getting even worse. So for sure, what is true in the report, and I can only confirm, is this decline in standards concerning constraints on governmental powers, open government, and in protection of fundamental rights. In Poland, it is a result of taking over political sub of the Constitutional Court, strong attack on judicial independence, including suspension of a couple of judges. Even today, you know, when we talk, one more judge in Poland has just been today suspended by the disciplinary chamber, which should not operate at all because there was a judgment of the Court of Justice of the EU, but still this chamber is operating. It is because of number of disciplinary proceedings pending against judges. It is because of the role of public media that are providing just pure governmental propaganda, and sometimes they are just very openly used as a method of instrumentalization of people's dignity, or as a method of just attacking political enemies, or using the slap litigation against some independent thinkers like Professor Wojciech Sadurski, renowned constitutional law scholar, but also a critic of the government. It is also a problem of closure of information, of access to public information, but also the manipulation with information, which is becoming part of the simply like the typical governmental strategy. And moreover, in 2020, we have experienced one of the most dramatic moments in the Polish democracy after 1989, which is the non-organization of presidential elections. So they were planned to take place on 10th of May, 2020, and they just didn't happen. They were just recalled by two politicians with the violation of all different standards, and nobody faced any responsibility for this. So I think one of the most important parts in this context is the lack of accountability for abuses. So if those abuses happen, then simply nobody from the government is ready, or there is no even working machinery to face any responsibility. So the only responsibility, accountability we have is still some kind of a public opinion, public discourse on what is happening in a country. Please note that with respect to fundamental rights, it was also a dramatic year, because the Constitutional Court issued an important judgment restricting access to abortion. It resulted in a number of demonstrations. And of course, the COVID was used in order to stop those demonstrations, in order to constrain people's ability to participate in the exchange of their views in exercising the freedom of assembly. But we had numerous situations where people were stopped, where they were restricted in their freedom of speech, and also LGBT plus rights were restricted, and LGBT communities were attacked with homophobic language, unfortunately also by even by the highest representatives of the state. So when you see this table and you see that fundamental rights are neglected, yes, they were, and they are still neglected. It is interesting to see that with respect to two categories, order and security and civil justice, the situation remains unchanged. In general, you don't have this feeling, but for sure what we observe is that the problem with judiciary is already affecting lack of proceedings in civil cases. So you have cases concerning customers that have loans denominated in Swiss francs, and they have a huge difficulty in getting justice in their cases. So this situation translates into like a real effectiveness of the justice system. I was very interested in this category, absence of corruption, because when you look into this category, you may feel that corruption is basically not that we do not have that significant problem with corruption. But please note, the problem of Poland is not so much maybe corruption, but cronyism. When you have a number of state-owned companies that are providing a lot of resources to politicians, their families, then their affiliates, then simply they don't need to be corrupted. They just take the public money in unhindered way. And moreover, that is a way of like paying for the political service. So if you create like this wide range of the state controlled entities with a huge amount of money, then basically you are creating like a new elite. And moreover, even if this elite is abusing some powers, is abusing some financial rules, then it is the prosecutor general who is at the same time Minister of Justice. So there is nobody to hold you accountable. So the control over the prosecution office is, in my opinion, one of the most important fragment of the situation. So the level, so maybe this factor about absence of corruption is also because of the fact that the government is not interested in following the corruption cases if they are within the ruling camp. I would like just to say just two more sentences. I think I see the trend, and maybe maybe your researchers should look into this next year in the context of regulatory environment, because on the surface it may seem that everything is not that bad. But please note, this year there was an attempt to deprive of the major private television of the license to operate. So the case was so loud that even Joe Biden has expressed publicly his hesitation, or at least Antony Blinken has mentioned about this. Only if not the intervention of the US administration, most probably the TVN, the major television station, would lose the license to operate. But I see also a problem of, on the one hand, takeover of private enterprises by state-owned companies, and also the nationalization of some industries, which means that this regulatory environment is not becoming competitive. You do not have an equal protection of law in certain segments if you are a private enterprise operating in the same segment as the state-owned company. I think this is something interesting, because so you see here that this kind of a leviathan is kind of like eating more and more spheres of public life. And finally, what is the response of Polish authorities? The response is almost the same. Poland and Hungary are like twin brothers in responding. Intervention by the EU is a threat to national sovereignty. It is an act of ultra-virus. We are not going to obey by those judgments that are constituting interference into our constitutional identity and constitutional order. But I would say that Poland is going even more, because Poland started to challenge with the use of the Constitutional Court, not only the EU treaty as such and jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, but also even the European Convention on Human Rights. So just 2 weeks ago, we had a judgment questioning the compliance with the Constitution of the European Convention on Human Rights. So sometimes I think that simply the level of radicalism in Poland is so strong that Hungary may learn from our example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your intervention. And I read, similar to Petra's intervention, that you indeed identify a trend that has taken place over time. The crucial dates 2011, 2015, respectively, for Hungary and Poland, and how the deterioration of, let's say, the compliance with rule of law standards has taken shape, and how this has fundamentally altered the quality of democracy in both countries. Now, we have a couple of comments and questions already in the chat. I'm very happy to hear that and to see that, to read them. I would like to perhaps start with one that perhaps Dr. Pancha would like to take on, which is again on the methodology of the index by an anonymous attendee from our discussion here, asking, is actually every of the 44 individual indicators weighted equally, or are there some factors given higher importance in the indexing of the overall countries? And also regarding fundamental rights and law enforcement, how are you taking societal technological changes and people's communication habits into account? This is one of them. Then I think we have really two interesting questions from Barbara Graboska-Morosh on, by and large, what can we do, right? What can we do with the results of the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index? On the one hand, what could the actual EU annual rule of law report learn, or could it actually help to actually improve the EU annual rule of law report? Could it borrow elements from the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index? And secondly, also very interesting, how should actually EU member states make actually use of the World Justice Project report and index, but also other international indexes to which degree should they basically be, if I may call it, lampposts to which you refer in your assessment of the situation in the EU. And then we have one question actually posed to Petra by Kathleen Miklosi, but actually it's also a question for Adam. In the case the opposition wins in a next election, in Hungary it would be spring 2022, in Poland for now. We have more questions in the chat, but perhaps we can take this as a first round to basically kick off.
That in principle are more or less equally important, and we didn't want to. We performed several exercises over the years, but we thought that the simplest exercise was to weight it equally. And to some of the the second question, I think I mean it's quite challenging to measure all the different components of the rule of law. It's so broad. Adam was, for example, mentioning the case of corruption, and indeed corruption, we have about 70 questions, and he's right. There are very few questions, for example, about cronyism, nepotism, favoritism, state capture, that is the prevalent form of corruption in many countries. So it's really hard to try to capture them all. And indeed, even if those scores show low scores, even though there may be some other aspects that are not as bad in the aggregate, they compensate. So the issue of the media is one of these is one of these cases. So the index was built a few years ago, just with a more traditional view of the elements that may affect the media freedom. Some of them which we are seeing still today, just in the attacks to the media and to civil society. But something that we have seen in the last few years is the use of social media and technology and so on to essentially polarize the conversation and distort reality and attack just the possible checks, governmental and non-governmental checks through these channels. And this is something that we do not capture in the index. We have seen it just in the last few years. It was, I mean, we're considering right now whether we should develop additional indicators and how to present those. The challenge is we want also to have some comparability over time, but at the same time adapt to the new realities that we're seeing, and that's a challenge. On the use, very briefly, I think that the intention of generating these types of indicators is to use two possible levers of change. And probably three possible levers of change. So one is the funds, right? And by funds, what I mean is that there are some international institutions, international organizations, multilateral organizations, the EU itself, that uses some of these indicators to allocate funding to certain states and so on. Particularly one important one, even the market uses these through rating agencies. Rating agencies usually need these kind of indicators to assess political risk, and then as a result, have some effect on the cost of debt, which is actually an interesting lever to push countries to show or to try to change. I mean, whether it's an important one or not, that's something to discuss, but it's a lever working through the international channels. The second one is related to this one. It's not necessarily related to funding, but it's through these mechanisms that we may see, particularly the EU. It's a very interesting example in which they can use this information to frame somehow to help frame the discussion. So there we have seen the EU report. This is really just a report that takes into account all the different institutions in the country. And this is probably one of the sources that they use to fit that report. It's not the only one, it's a much more comprehensive report, but essentially just working through the EU mechanisms of, I mean, whether they can work or not, I mean, within the institutional framework, but that's an additional lever that could be used. And the third one is the public opinion, not just, and that's one in which when the report is published, how much of this is captured by the media and so on, and at least just helping some of the public discussion. And the channel here is just how effective can the report be when sometimes there is little discussions in countries. But at least the advantage is that it is a report that is produced by an independent organization that uses the methodology consistently across the world, and that it's something that is important. It's not created by experts living abroad or anything like that. This is just based on information collected in the country, which has additional legitimacy or adds legitimacy to the report. So these are probably some of the three mechanisms by which the report could be used to promote change in countries.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Petra.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just very briefly, how the EU and the member states could use the report. I think EU institutions can, of course, directly rely on it. Because before coming any rule of law enforcement, whether it takes the form of an Article 7 proceeding or an infringement procedure or the conditionality regulation, they must engage in a monitoring of what is happening on the ground. And I think that this monitoring, however, has to be contextual and also EU specific. So whereas outside reports can be relied upon, and especially the one under scrutiny would be a very good candidate for that, the EU has to do more than that. No external entity will take the specificities of EU law into consideration, such as the primacy of EU law or the issue of how to reconcile Article 2 values with mutual recognition, for example. So this is the job that the EU must take up. So this is why I contend that the Justice Project report has twofold relevance for the European Union. On the one hand, direct reliance or that, and on the other hand, when we design this EU scrutiny, whether it's done by the Commission in the frame of the annual rule of law report, as Kolja said, or some external Copenhagen committee or some other expert body, the methodology, which is very transparent and very professional, could be relied upon. And as to the member states, I think the member states, they also have a role, of course, in rule of law enforcement. I, however, put the emphasis on the responsibility and the role of the Commission as guardian of the treaties, which is the prime player in the enforcement of the treaties, including Article 2, the EU values. But of course, the member states also have a role in explaining to their citizens why this is happening, what is happening, and in the worst case scenario, in the best case scenario, just intervene, for example, into rule of law related cases on the side of the Commission, just to show their support. And in a worst case scenario, perhaps take over the role of the Commission, for example, in the form of infringement procedures, because the treaties allow one member state to scrutinize another member state and to push it to comply with the treaties also with relation to values. As to Catalin's question, I think that this is the million-dollar question: how constitutionalism will be restored, especially in a country when even if there is a government change, the new government is highly likely not to have a supermajority, which would be needed for changing the constitution, and the cardinal laws, which are system relevant, and also in a state where there is a parallel deep state created that is basically taking over the role of the future executive, and there are people already serving in these deep state institutions that are loyal to the government on the one hand, and on the other hand, they are entrenched there, they are placed there for extremely long periods of time, overarching several elections, in fact. So I think, well, I do not have the philosopher's stone, unfortunately. What I can very briefly say is there are several things that are doable also with simple majority laws. For example, you can have new people in the police, in the secret services. You can make the police investigate corruption cases. You can make them public in the media. And I also like, from the proposals which are in favor of a new constitution, the public debate, taking people seriously, create a constitutional moment, have a discussion, and then perhaps have a new constitution that is reinforced, perhaps by a referendum. I understand under the current constitutional setting, this is not necessarily possible, but once the public support there, I think this is the legal issue that can be overcome. Otherwise, I personally would be rather cautious with abolishing 2/3 majority laws or even constitutional provisions by a simple majority. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. And our time is limited. We have received additional questions, but Adam, I would suggest that you stick to the questions which I gave to you. And then we have afterwards a very quick last round where everybody can pick her or his favorite question. Adam, to you.
Thank you. Just two issues. The first issue is, what the EU and member states may take out of this report. I think that EU was having for years a problem with basically assessing member states, because it always created a controversy. And even I remember that EU Fundamental Rights Agency was very cautious in not, even by making different kind of benchmarking of just giving, let's say, notes to countries. So it is always a risky business because it involves politics, and that's why the European Commission Rule of Law report is so much descriptive. But it does not mean that the EU should simply be silent on that kind of reports. I can imagine that that kind of a report could be subject of a special hearing before the LIBE committee. That simply you are presenting your methodology and you are giving the floor to some invited guests to talk about it and just inform members of European Parliament about the outcome of your research. And in the same way, I think that, and of course, I don't mean on your report. For example, the Reporters Without Borders report on the freedom of speech could also be subject of a proper parliamentary debate at the level of the European Parliament. And the same should happen at the national level. In my opinion, that kind of reports, which are prepared on a universal level, on a global level, and are providing such a detailed information, should be subject of reflection of a major control institutions like parliamentary committees. So that is what I would suggest. And in ideal world, the Prime Minister should have that kind of a report, look into it and start to think, okay, so what we should repair in order to correct our position in this report. And there are some good practices like this. Not, I don't know, maybe with your reports it goes this way. But please note that with the Doing Business report by the World Bank, that is what happens. Countries are competing with each other and they are correcting their achievements in order to be higher in the question of economic performance. So maybe that is, some kind of an idea to create a pressure on states to use that kind of reports, including your reports, in this way. When it comes to the second question, I will be brief. First, first the opposition has to win elections. Second, it is the effort for a generation. You will not do it just within half a year, 1 year. You will have to spend a lot of time on construing a new development of the rule of law standards, because the deterioration was so heavy that it will require a lot of effort and a lot of ups and downs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. And now we are coming to our quick last 2 minutes. Our time is already up, but let's, because of the great interest in the audience, raising still a lot of questions, pick up a couple of them. Joel Grogan is basically asking, what is the ideal impact of this report in Hungary and Poland, but also elsewhere? What is the ideal impact? Jean Bousset is asking, how can we actually improve hearing those voices in rule of law backsliding countries which still advocate rule of law principles? How can we actually make the other voices heard? Alfredo Rizzi is questioning the following: is the anti-EU propaganda just rhetoric? To which degree do actually countries where we have a certain anti-EU rhetoric still willing to stay in the EU? So to which degree can we actually accept the fact, or I should rather say, can we speculate that Polexit, as some people call it, is perhaps not even something to be expected? Why could it just be rhetoric? And then two questions which I like to link. Is conditionality still the right tool? And that's what Dieter Berkham is asking, and Carlos Closa is going a step further and asking, should the EU perhaps externalize the scrutiny of the rule of law? Or should the Commission still go on and do the scrutinizing of rule of law conditionality throughout the process? So these are 5 questions. You can pick and choose which ones you like to answer. And perhaps I go in reverse order and I start this time with Adam.
I think this is an extremely interesting question concerning externalization of the preparation of that kind of report. But, you know, there is one important question to be asked. Okay, let's imagine that we are externalizing preparation of that kind of report and we give it to some kind of an institution in Hungary or in Poland, to some university. So I would like to ask the question, to which institution that would be independent enough and that would not be under huge pressure by the government in such a situation? Most usually, those institutions that would be able to prepare independent report in such a situation and would know the details are at the same time fighters for the rule of law. And of course they know all the details, but then it might be quite difficult for them to not to get into the criticism for making that kind of tender. So I think it is the sensitive issue here. And second, I think that the preparation of that kind of a report by the Commission is giving a voice to all different groups and all different organizations, and even speaking about it, explaining, consulting, having this feeling of consultation is in my opinion not just a question of the result, but a question of solidarity. So the process is already something important here. Maybe, you know, it would be good to externalize reviewing, peer review of that kind of reports. That would be more useful, because it seems to me that the Commission is still basically developing their methodology, and I think they are not yet looking into so deeply into practices of organizations like World Justice Project. With respect to conditionality, just one thing: if anybody can tell me what is the other option on the table, then I would be very happy, because I cannot see any other option on the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. And Petra, to you.
I am absolutely with you on that last point, Adam, and all the others, but let me single out the questions by Professor Gergen and Closa. So Joel, thank you very much for the question. I don't think that these reports will help a highly divided society such as the Hungarian one. I don't think that they are necessarily the target audience of these. Just let me give you a very personal example, because so far I was talking in the abstract when I refer to the Gongo criticizing the report. But recently I gave an interview to a online platform close to the governing party, because I still believe in dialogue with the people, at least. And I was asked the question whether Hungary was still a state based on the rule of law, and I referred to the numbers that we are discussing today, and international think tanks, and you just don't want to know the extent of hate mails that I received as a consequence. So I think that the target audience is somewhere else, frankly. As to Carlos's question, I personally don't think that the Commission is best suited to do the job, especially because the self-perception of the Commission, and this is not just the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, but also the previous ones, is that it's a political commission, it's a geopolitical and a political commission. And if it is one, or if this is what they claim, then this will be an extremely easy target for those who are being criticized. So if I may choose between the option presented by the Commission in the form of the annual rule of law report and the European Parliament's Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights Pact, for example, pushing for an expert body, and they come up, for example, with a selection of experts themselves. I'm not saying this is ideal, but I think this is the better way to go in order to be absolutely certain that not only that the scrutiny is objective, but also that those who are scrutinizing the member states are seen as objective by all member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Petra and Alejandro. The last words to you.
Yeah, not much to add, but I will guess. I guess that a last point on how the reports could be used. I agree. I mean, sometimes, particularly in very polarized societies, it's very difficult to introduce a report just in within the society. The parts are not willing to talk to each other, but it's important still to have this kind of information. There are still a lot of rule of law in general just is very complex, and there are a lot of players, and the more information we have, the more detailed information we have for the discussion, the better. Sometimes these kind of reports can complement quite well other types of analysis. I mean, and particularly to one of the points that Adam was making, that it can show trends over time. I mean, that these things can be deteriorating. That is very difficult to show with other types of reports about a status that we see. So it's important. It's an additional piece of information. I think also trying to find all the different players. I mean, that when we talk about rule of law, they are both external and internal players. Just the EU is obviously an important one, but even within countries, we know that there are opposition groups. I mean, even not necessarily only at the national level, but in many cases at the regional level. So the more detailed information, the better. We indeed are going to start a new project at the subnational level in Europe to generate new data, new indicators, a massive project. So we think that it's better actually just to have these discussions with data, with evidence, than without it.
Thank you so much for, on the one hand, presenting the Rule of Law Index, and also for the discussion of it, for giving us the context, for qualifying some of the findings, which basically was an interpretation of what is behind the numbers, if I may say so. So thanks a lot again to Alejandro, Petra, and Adam. And I would like to thank all of our attendees today for the great questions. We couldn't take on all your questions because time was running out. We are actually over time, but let me share with you as well that more than 2/3 of you made it until the very end of our webinar. So that's excellent, and shows how much interest there was in the discussion, but also obviously in the presentations. If you want to know more about the rule of law and democracy in Europe, have a look at our website, the RECONNECT website, but also the World Justice Report. Obviously, I would like to say thank you to everybody and good night. And let's hope that 2022 will be a better year for the rule of law.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
You. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.